So this is going to be a video on Auden's Epitaph on a Tyrant. I could split it up into, as I will be doing for the other poems, the motivation, the representation of motivation, and then the representation of political impacts. But because it's such a short poem, I think it's literally 5 lines, I think it will actually be easier for me to go through the poem in its entirety. And that also means that you know, you've got one of the poems really quickly analysed for you, and you can keep that as a backup, or you can choose to use it within your essay. But it will actually be really good to have like a really cohesive understanding of this poem, and because it's so short, and it's so easy to remember, we may as well go through the whole thing. Okay, so the first thing to note in terms of its context is that it was published when Hitler first invaded Poland, so it does have a transatlantic quality in that it's embedded directly within crisis, and as a result of that we see a lot of convoluted emotion which comes through the adverb because they're very messy in nature. In terms of what Auden has done in order to represent politics, he actually uses the voice of a tyrant but satirizes it. And he also implies that it is commemorative towards a tyrant because of the word epitaph, which implies death. And it's also quite ambiguous in nature in that he doesn't actually specify on a specific tyrant. It could have been Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Franco, any of them, because it was published in a time of real international political turbulence where there were a lot of dictatorships. Okay, so the first line is perfection of a kind was what he was after. Now the first thing to note is the how perfection has been foregrounded. So that indicates, that represents what the political motivation is. So it could, if you were interpreting this as a critique of Hitler, it could be indicative of, you know, the perfect Aryan race which he was after, but ultimately, basically what perfection does is it represents what that dictatorship's or what that tyrant's political motivation is. We have of a kind, which is really subjective. It's an enigmatic phrase, and as a result we can really see that this comes down to individual perception, especially because it's not a political group, it's literally one single tyrant. And as a result, you know, it shows that tyrant's perfection, or that tyrant's perception of perfection, is going to be very much subjective on his views. We also here have Auden use a he rather than, you know, the tyrant or the person. So he uses a non-specific third person pronoun. So this means that his poem is able to represent a universal anonymous figure. It can apply to any of the tyrants of 1939, and I think that actually links back to the way he has used tyrant within his title as opposed to epitaph on Hitler or epitaph on Mussolini. Basically here he's able to represent the multitude of political actors within 1939 and how they all had some sort of goal, some sort of perfection they were after, which was very much enigmatic and subjective upon their own personal views. Okay, so, and the poetry he invented was easy to understand, right? So we've got poetry, which is representative of propaganda, and easy to understand, which shows that his message was enforced. He knew human folly like the back of his hand. So the back of his hand has connotations of violence, first off, and I think that's how Auden is representing that often the nature of political individuals, especially those who are authoritarian, will use violence as a means of control. We have the use of simile, so he knew human folly like the back of his hand, which really indicates the need to, I guess it represents how those political leaders felt this deep-seated need to improve or to reshape any perceived weaknesses. So a really obvious example of this is how Hitler felt like he needed to improve Germany by getting rid of all of the Jews and Gypsies and anyone that wasn't perfect in terms of being Aryan. So this is a really good link to how Auden represents how political leaders will manipulate or will enforce systemized political violence in order to gain in order to achieve what they perceive to be perfection. Okay. And he was greatly interested in armies and fleets. So here we have war imagery, which is juxtaposed against connotations of a game. And it's set in a really satirical, playful voice. So again, Auden is representing how these political leaders have like a deep disregard, very little regard for the actual citizens and for, you know, the individuals within their country. And instead, it's more of a territorial game or a national game which fails to recognize the individual. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter. So here we've got the metaphor of burst, and what it does is it really represents this tension through connotations of explosion or for erupting. And as a result of that, the whole concept of laughter becomes really sinister because it feels really forced. And I guess what that does is, I guess that could represent shared perspectives where government officials will often parallel their view to that of the tyrants out of fear, so out of a desire to, you know, I guess not be different or not be seen to be different, and therefore, you know, seek political protection. And now to the last line, when he cried, little children died in the streets. So what we've got is we've got this abrupt shock, like ending, which really highlights this irrationality of the tyrant. So we've got the internal rhyme between cried and died, which I think is representative of the overall pain that is imposed upon society as a result of the tyrant's own personal political motivations. We've also got the intertextuality to the rise of the Dutch Republic, which was by Motley in 1985. And this is subverted because it removes any sense of respect and reverence for the dictator, and it instead creates this really powerful and emotively charged image of death and suffering. What's also interesting here is Auden uses a hyperlarge. So a hyperlarge is a reversal of expectation, and he uses that to highlight, you know, the abrupt, shocking endings that will come out of authoritarian figures. And I guess that is representative of how unpredictable they are, and how quite often what the surrounding community will expect them to do won't actually materialize, because it's very much within their own personal perception and within their personal political motivations. So that's just a brief summary of Epitaph on a Tyrant. It is, like I said, really short and sweet, and it's a good poem to start off with, I believe, because it really does give you an idea of how Auden, you know, he mocks these political motivations, and he really highlights through his representation of political dictatorships and politics as a whole, how unpredictable it is in nature, but also the deep impact it will have on the individual and society as a whole.